Formula One is a sport that is full of history. And if you're a new fan, one of the things that may be difficult for you is figuring out which of the 10 teams you want to support. But today we are going to start solving that problem. Welcome back to Grid Chat University. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and if you're new here, normally this podcast is covering the active season of Formula One. But since there is no racing until March, which actually hurts to say, we are using the off-season for a basic series. Every episode we are breaking down something different about the sport, and the goal is that if you start listening to this series at the very beginning, and you listen to every episode until we get to actual lights out when we get to Australia, you should understand the basics of everything you need to know to get started watching Formula One. You may not know the highly specific parts, but you will know enough to sit down, watch a race by yourself, and maybe even answer some questions your friends have. So far, we've already talked about how a race weekend works, the point system, how we have 2 championships, the format of a race weekend, and we did a whole episode breaking down a lot of the jobs that make a Formula One team possible, getting deeper than just talking about the drivers themselves. If you haven't listened to those episodes yet, and those are things that you would like to learn, you can go back before this episode wherever you're listening or watching this podcast and catch up on those first 2 basics episodes. But now that you do understand those basics, one of the most important parts of getting into any sport is having someone to root for and a bunch of people to root against. And if you're brand new to Formula One, it can be sometimes hard to pick a team, especially if the country that you're from doesn't have a team that you feel a certain amount of national allegiance to, or same thing for the drivers. One of the things that is kind of different about Formula One as opposed to other sports like basketball or football or things like that is that because there are so few teams and so few drivers, everyone may not be represented by a sort of local element to it, right? So if that's the case, how do you pick your team? The answer, my friend, is on vibes. But you can't get to know those vibes if you don't know things like the history of the team, the people who make it up. You can't figure out if your vibes align with your team's unless you have a guide to the vibes. So today we are starting the vibe guide. If I tried to put all of the vibes of all 10 teams into one episode, we would be here for hours at a time. So instead, you are getting 10 individual episodes of Grid Chat. Those episodes are going to come out much faster than our normal weekly release. So I guess prepare to be sick of me. In my best attempt to not be biased and make you like a certain team, the order that we're going to break these teams down in is just going to be based off of how the championship standings ended last season, which means that today's episode is all about McLaren. So by the end of this episode, you'll know a little bit about the history of the McLaren Formula One team, how it was founded, who was behind that, some of the big moments in the team's history, the more iconic ones, and the slumps. Plus, we'll catch you up on the main figures of the team right now and a couple of big moments from last year. And in the end, we are going to get a little opinionated because I'm going to tell you what I think some of the strengths and weaknesses are of the team, and also some of the positives and negatives of choosing McLaren as your Formula One team. So let's start with history. McLaren was founded in 1963, 13 years after the start of Formula One itself. The team was founded by Bruce McLaren. He was a New Zealand racing driver, and he had raced in Formula One prior to forming his own team. And if you know a little bit about Bruce McLaren, you'll know a little bit about the heart of the team, I think. Bruce grew up in Auckland, New Zealand, and he was not actually the healthiest of kids. When he was 9 years old, he fell ill with something called Perth's disease. And though he did battle and get better, that period of time being ill did actually leave him with permanent effects. One of his legs was actually longer than the other, and this left him with a permanent limp. However, Bruce did not allow this to keep him from his dreams of being a professional athlete. He worked his way up racing in Auckland and eventually made his way to Europe as a Formula One driver. He raced for a team that was around then called the Cooper Formula One team. And in 1959, he set a record. He became the youngest driver to ever win a Formula One Grand Prix at 22 years old. He set that record in 1959, and it was not broken until 2003, when Fernando Alonso won the Hungarian Grand Prix, and he was also 22 years old at the time, but he was a few months younger than Bruce, so technically speaking, he broke the record. Bruce formed his company in 1963, and they made it into Formula One in 1966, and while he was racing in Formula One through his own team, he was also building and racing sports cars. In 1966, he won the 24 Hours of Le Mans, which if you're not familiar with that is an endurance race. It's actually sort of the endurance race, but that's a totally different episode. And he also won 5 consecutive titles in the Can-Am series in North America. And in 1968, he won his first Formula One Grand Prix for McLaren, which was McLaren's very first team win. By 1970, Bruce had decided he wanted to expand the McLaren brand even further, and he started to actually develop road cars, which is the McLaren brand you may be familiar with even outside of Formula One or racing in general. Because of this, at the start of the season, he told his friends and family that he was starting to look at how he could take time away from being a driver and start to focus on only building the McLaren brand as a business. And he told some of his close friends and family that he intended to hang up his helmet at the end of that season and completely retire from being a driver. However, very devastatingly, on June 2nd, 1970, Bruce was testing one of their Can-Am cars, and he lost control of the vehicle, crashing into a Marshall stand. Bruce was killed instantly, and while the rest of the team was devastated by their loss, they did what they could to cement Bruce's legacy. They continued racing, and they had a pretty good run at it. Bruce McLaren, being from New Zealand, is why you may have heard Liam Lawson, who's also a New Zealand driver, we'll get to him when we get to his episode, say that he feels that they should actually play the New Zealand national anthem rather than a British national anthem. McLaren is actually headquartered in the UK, so they actually race under the British flag. And it depends on how you look at it, but I would say regardless of what flag they fly under, McLaren has actually maintained a lot of the legacy and heart that Bruce originally brought to the team when he started it. So let's talk a little bit about what happened between 1970 and today. McLaren is the second oldest team on the grid. The only older team actually is Ferrari, and we'll be talking about them in depth next episode. And Ferrari also has them beat in one other category, which is being the most successful team on the grid. McLaren themselves are the second most successful team on the grid. They have won 9 Constructors' Championships and 12 Drivers' Championships. The first championships they won were in 1974, when they won both the Drivers' and the Constructors' Championships that year. This was 4 years after Bruce had passed, and the team was really starting to get things under their feet. The drivers they had that year when they won those first championships were Emerson Fittipaldi and James Hunt. And 1974 was also the first year that they were sponsored by the cigarette company Marlboro. You may have seen kind of those more iconic images of the older Formula One cars sponsored by those brands. And the Marlboro McLaren car, I think, is one of the more recognizable ones from that era. In 1976, they won another Drivers' Championship, but they didn't win another Constructors' Championship until 1984. In 1981, the team actually merged with Ron Dennis's team. That team was called Project 4 Racing. Ron Dennis then took over as the team principal, and that's when we started to see a very dominant era of McLaren. By 1984, McLaren enters the most dominant period that they had had yet, and they take the Constructors' Championship in 1984, 1985, 1988, 1989, 1990, and 1991. And in 1986, while they didn't win the Constructors' Championship, they did win the Drivers' Championship. During this period, they also had some of the most recognizable names in classic Formula One history as their drivers. Those included drivers like Niki Lauda, Alain Prost, and Ayrton Senna. And while they still remained pretty dominant through 1994, even though they weren't winning championships, they were fighting for titles, by the middle of the 1990s, they started to lose out on some of the things that made them very special. Their engine supplier, which was Honda, had pulled out of Formula One. One of their very best drivers, Senna, had left the team, and the team really started to decline. However, by 1998, they had turned over a new era. By then, they had brought in Mercedes as their engine supplier, and they also had snatched up a little guy named Adrian Newey. Now, we'll get pretty deep into Adrian Newey when we talk about Red Bull, but what you need to know is that Adrian Newey is one of the most legendary car designers in Formula One. He has been able to make winning cars at massively dominant eras for 3 teams so far. Those include Williams, McLaren, and Red Bull. And he's headed over to Aston Martin, which again, we'll get deeper into those things when we get into those teams episodes, but bringing him over to McLaren was a pretty good move. In 1998, they win both the Constructor and the Drivers' Championship, and in 1999, they win just the Drivers' Championship. And in the 2000s, they still continue to do pretty good, even though they're not winning titles. However, in 2007, a little-known driver named Lewis Hamilton enters Formula One, and his first home was McLaren. In 2007, Lewis Hamilton's rookie year with McLaren, he finishes in second, 1 point behind Kimi Räikkönen, who was driving for Ferrari at the time. And in 2008, Lewis Hamilton wins his very first Drivers' Championship with McLaren. In 2013, Lewis Hamilton leaves McLaren for Mercedes, and McLaren's decline starts again. 2013 was one of their worst seasons in history, and they continued to tweak things. They changed their engine supplier to Honda for a few years, then they switched from Honda to Renault, then they switch again from Renault back to Mercedes, which is still the engine supplier to this day. Now, a couple of things before we get into the current era of McLaren. When I said that McLaren really holds on to a lot of that original spirit that Bruce McLaren had, one of the big reasons I say that is that McLaren is one of the Formula One teams that has their hands in so many different parts of motorsports. Let's talk a little bit about the other places that you can find McLaren outside of the Formula One grid. Outside of just having a Formula One team, McLaren is one of the names that you can see in a number of other racing series. In addition to Formula One, McLaren also competes in IndyCar, and they compete in Extreme E and Formula E. McLaren Automotive, which is responsible for like the road cars that you might drive, also has a customer racing division. So you will see other teams in IMSA actually using McLaren cars. So one of the cool things about becoming a McLaren fan is that you have a pretty easy in to become a fan of other series. I personally am a really big fan of one of McLaren's IndyCar drivers, Pato O'Ward. And so if you do find that your vibes align with McLaren, the cool thing is that you can use it as sort of a gateway series to get you into these other series. If you decide you want to start watching Extreme E, why not just follow the same team over there? All your merch is the same, the vibes are the same, and you can just jump right into being a fan. And the other cool thing about McLaren historically being involved in so many different racing series is that they have accomplished a really cool feat in motorsports that only 3 teams have, and that is winning the Motorsports Triple Crown. Winning the Triple Crown means winning 3 of the most prestigious races in motorsports. The first is the 24-hour of Le Mans, the second is the Indy 500, and the third is the Monaco Grand Prix. McLaren is one of the very few that have ever accomplished this feat. And I think what's really cool about that, our sort of first vibe check of the episode, is that McLaren has a history of loving motorsport. And I think that's because it was founded by someone who loved motorsport in all of its iterations and loved it so much that it was everything that he dedicated his entire life to. And what is cool is that McLaren has continued to hold on to that legacy even as the team has changed hands. So now that you know a little bit about the history of McLaren, how it was formed, and honestly the years waves of greatness that they have in their background, let's talk a little bit about what the team looks like right now. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, the reason we're starting with McLaren is that they actually won the Constructors' Championship last year in 2024. This was the first Constructors' Championship that they had won since 1998, and they're hopeful that they'll be able to continue that kind of winning streak moving into this next season. McLaren's two drivers are Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. And when we talk about vibes in general, last year this was one of the youngest driver pairings on the grid. Lando Norris is the older and more experienced of the two drivers. He's 25 years old, he's British, and his number is 4. A little fun fact in terms of vibes, if you look at his logo, I actually really think it's one of the better logos of drivers on the grid right now. It's an L and an N, which are his initials, but the way they come together makes it also look like the number 4, which is his driver number. Lando's very first race in Formula 1 was in 2019 with the Australian Grand Prix, and he didn't win a race until 2024 at the Miami Grand Prix, which, just not to brag, I was there. We were in the start-finish grandstand and I took my dad, and to this day he is very positive he is the reason why that curse was finally broken. Lando is the type of driver who is a little bit self-deprecating, and I bring that up because when we talk about how long it took him to get to a win, we used to hear this saying, Lando no wins. However, when he did finally win that first Grand Prix, he made his own merch which included Lando no wins with the no wins crossed out. Lando actually has 4 race wins now and 26 podiums total for his career. He finished second in the Drivers' Championship this past season, and when we talk about vibes, a couple of other things that I think are kind of fun to know about Lando in case you're picking your favorite driver. He also actively streams video games and racing, and what I'm about to say is actually a pretty positive thing, but I think it can sometimes be construed as negative. He's got frat boy energy, okay? It's a good thing. I really think it's fun, it's silly, and sometimes you should enjoy yourself as much as you can. When it comes to vibes, Lando has a very thin balance between enjoying life a lot, having a lot of fun, and also being really hard on himself when he doesn't succeed. I think Lando is sometimes his own worst enemy because he can get into his head and worry a little bit too much about what people think of him. One of the biggest criticisms he had last year was this idea that he is a little too nice to be a champion. And that's kind of a bigger debate that we could have and we have discussed before, this idea of what it means to be a winner and whether or not that means you have to have certain personality traits that maybe aren't actually suitable for you. But I think what people grab onto when they talk about this is how much it seems to affect him when other people talk about him. Lando is objectively a very good competitor, and it's highly likely that he will be a strong competitor for this year's Drivers' Championship. So choosing Lando Norris is not necessarily a bad move if you like to win, which is not really actually something we would have said up until last year. A couple of fun facts about his past. Lando Norris started karting at the age of 7, and at one point he was so small and weighed so little that they actually had to Velcro him into his cart to make sure that he wouldn't fly away. Lando had a very impressive junior career, and in 2017 he signed with McLaren's Young Driver program. By 2019 he was brought up to Formula 1, which was after he finished second to George Russell in Formula 2 the previous year. And then, like I said, he competed from 2019 all the way to 2024 before he had that very first race win. And last year he had, quite frankly, a banger of a season. That season started out with really no indication that he would be a championship contender and ended with him helping bring McLaren to their first Constructors' Championship in the 2000s. Now, the other driver for McLaren is Oscar Piastri. And among other things, I would actually say Oscar Piastri is known for delivering one of the most famous tweets in Formula 1 history. He was signed to Alpine's Driver Academy. Now, if you're new to Formula 1, driver academies may not be super familiar to you, but essentially in very simple terms, when you're signed to a driver academy, it means that that team is actually spending money, time, and effort developing you with the intention of you eventually driving for their Formula 1 team. However, obviously every team only has 2 seats, and while some driver academies do fill multiple teams, like for example the Ferrari Driver Academy might see drivers go directly to Ferrari, but more likely they'll see them go to their junior team Haas before making the move upwards. Similarly, you can see the same thing with Red Bull's Driver Academy and their V-Carb team, but when it comes to Alpine, they only have the one team. And there are obviously always going to be more drivers in the Driver Academy than eventually make it to Formula 1, given that there are only 2 seats. So Oscar was a member of that Alpine Driver Academy, meaning that the expectation was he would eventually drive for Alpine. And in 2022, one of those seats at Alpine actually became available, and the team made an announcement that Oscar would be driving for them in the following season. However, this is where we get a little bit of a lore drop, because on August 2nd, 2022, Oscar Piastri drops a tweet that you will continue to hear memed and repurposed throughout the rest of your Formula 1 fandom time. Oscar says, "I understand that without my agreement, Alpine F1 have put out a press release late this afternoon that I am driving for them next year. This is wrong, and I have not signed a contract with Alpine for 2023. I will not be driving for Alpine next year." There were a number of reasons why this tweet was so iconic, but quite frankly, to me, one of the biggest is the adamant need to say it again. I will not be driving for Alpine next year. What followed was honestly quite a bit of chaos because it was announced that he would actually, in fact, be driving for McLaren. This was a pretty bold move from the management side of McLaren to be able to kind of scoop this driver up, to be able to kind of take this driver away from the team that had developed him. And it was also a risky move on Oscar's part because they did did heavily threaten to sue him. But as you can tell just by the order of these episodes, obviously McLaren is a team that had a little bit more potential than Alpine did at the time. And that situation is the same currently. Alpine is much further down the grid than McLaren is. And Oscar has had a decently promising start with McLaren. Depending on who you listen to, people believe that he has a stronger chance at winning a driver's championship before his teammate Lando. And while he is still young and does make some young mistakes on track, Oscar has a lot of potential. And this past season, we saw him have to do something that is very difficult when it comes to Formula One. In Formula One teams, you're going to often hear something referred to as the first driver and the second driver. This is basically referring to the idea that there are two drivers that have to be competing in the team. They both have to be doing very well for the overall Constructors' Championship, but if they are both competing extremely well, at a certain point, one of them is going to have to be prioritized over the other in order for a Drivers' Championship to be won. During last season, a lot of the turmoil at McLaren came from the fact that they weren't willing to assign this first and second driver label. And so we saw a bit of fighting on track as Oscar tried to prove his worth to the team, and as Lando tried to prove that he could win a Drivers' Championship, something he ultimately did not achieve. And there are a ton of controversial moments that we could go through about last season when it comes to McLaren and this sort of like driver balance and who's most important and who's going to be the champion. But I would say you can also go back to Grid Chat episodes from those races and listen to the race recaps, because I made my feelings very clear in the moment. The thing that I think is important to know about Oscar is that he is an incredibly lethal driver when he wants to be. And we started to see a little bit of that come out last year. And ultimately, I think we'll see more of that come out this year. Oscar also won a race much faster than Lando Norris did and has 2 race wins and multiple sprint wins under his belt already. Now, Zak Brown is a name that you're going to hear all the time when it comes to McLaren. Zak is the CEO of McLaren, though sometimes he is confused as the team principal. The team principal is actually a man named Andrea Stella, but Zak has a very hands-on approach to the way he manages this team. Zak's very big lore drop is that he was a racer himself, but he was able to start that racing career because he competed on Wheel of Fortune in 1984. He is one of very few prominent Americans in Formula One, and he's actually from Los Angeles, California, just like me. Zak competed in racing himself before ultimately moving into management. Zak is actually one of the CEOs in Formula One that is highly present. And if we look a little bit at his background beyond the Wheel of Fortune win, I think you'll kind of see why. After Zak actually hung up his own helmet, he was working in marketing. He founded his own marketing company in 1995, and that company was then acquired in 2013. Zak also founded his own racing company, which is called United Autosport, and that team competes across a number of different series. It's also had drivers behind the wheels such as Fernando Alonso and, Lando Norris. And Zak also has some ties to Andretti Autosport, which will have a little bit of a presence on the grid starting in 2026 through Cadillac. Zak started working with McLaren in 2016, and by 2018, he had been named the CEO. And that culture shift has been pretty present ever since. The thing that you can definitely say about Zak Brown, whether you like him or not, is that he really loves racing. And I think you can see that by how much he tries to put his hands on every piece of McLaren. But Zak also loves winning, and sometimes people may feel that that mentality gets in the way of McLaren's ability to formally thrive. Now, when we talk about strengths and weaknesses when it comes to this team and things that you're going to deal with as a fan, one of the biggest strengths you're going to see next year is that they had a very strong car last year. Going into 2025, this is going to be the final season with these current regulations, which means that teams that have a car that are already competing at the highest of levels are going to have a bit of an advantage going into this season. They have less to change, less to figure out, and hopefully a more competitive base off the bat. You also have 2 very strong drivers in Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. And again, from the vibe side of things, you're going to have a good time whenever you put either of those drivers in front of a camera. I would also say on the positive side of things, when it comes to sort of like fandom and your ability to interact with the team, Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri are actually both pretty accessible and interested in the internet. You're going to get content and interactions from both of them. You're going to be able to tune into Lando Norris's streams. If those are the types of things that excite you about your connection with the driver, McLaren might be the team for you. Now, the negative that you're going to have with this team is this idea of the first and second driver. Their inability, or more so refusal, to say that they were prioritizing one driver over the other is a really big part of what caused problems for them last season. And if they are not willing to get into the season very quickly and figure those things out, you will have a lot of things that feel uncomfortable on track. We had some moments last year where things were very tense over the radio and where some kind of combative things were said in post-race press conferences. So the thing about McLaren is that you are going to have some pretty talented drivers, you're going to have a powerful car, you have a lot of money, and you have a strong kind of run from last year coming into this year. But management-wise, we have to wait and see whether or not they're going to change things from last year. Because if not, you're going to have a little bit of messiness as the season goes on, and as those points become more and more important for both the drivers and the Constructors' Championship standings. All of that being said, hopefully this episode has helped you understand a little bit about the culture of McLaren, a little bit about their history, and a little bit about the vibes that you're going into if you decide this is the team that you want to hang your hat on. Ultimately, it's not a bad team to choose. choose, especially if you like goofy and funny energy, and honestly, potentially winning. If this is the team that you've already chosen, hopefully you learned something in the history section. And if you're still choosing a team, I would love to know where McLaren currently stacks up for you. Next episode of Grid Chat, which will be out tomorrow, we will be talking about Ferrari. We'll go into the history of one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic names in Formula One, their journey to getting here, and what you're going to see for this coming season, which has already started with a bit of a shakeup. If you have any questions about this episode that you just listened to, episodes that you listened to in the past from this educational series, or questions about Formula One as a whole, make sure to go ahead and send those in. As we go through the series, I'm including question and answer sessions for things that I know I'm not going to answer in our episodes, and you can kind of think about these sessions as office hours. This is your chance to ask any question you might have about Formula One with no judgment. You can send those questions in a number of ways. If you're watching the podcast on YouTube, you can just leave those questions in the comment section down below. And if you're listening to the podcast elsewhere, you can either go to YouTube, find this episode, and leave your questions there, or you can find me on social media at Marissa Kumari. You can send in questions via Instagram, TikTok, or Threads. And again, the handle for that is at Marissa Kumari. I'll also include links to that in the episode description down below. And one final way that you can send in your questions is by joining our Grid Chat Discord server. You can find the link to that in the episode description, and when the season actually starts back up, we usually watch the races together, which is really fun, especially if you are someone who is watching Formula One all by yourself. So be sure to join that community now as well, so that you can start making friends with other Formula One fans. And me, I'm in the server as well. Until tomorrow, I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Be sure to send in any questions, and I will see you tomorrow for the Ferrari episode of Grid Chat University.